I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Bethany Jackson as our speaker today. Beth is a senior research fellow in modern slavery and sustainable ecosystems at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. And she's worked on a number of different projects that take different approaches to investigating connections between modern slavery, environmental degradation, and climate change. And her work has looked at that intersection in a number of different sectors and places, including food supply chains, brick kilns, aquaculture, and places including Bangladesh, India, and the Bahamas, as well as the UK. So she brings an incredible breadth and depth of expertise to this topic, as you'll see in relation to the particular project that she'll be speaking about today. So I'm going to hand over to Beth. I'll disappear off screen and then come back for the Q&A in a little bit. Over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Owen. I assume everyone can hear me. But yeah, thank you for having me today. It's really great to be here presenting on a research project that we did funded by the Modern Slavery PEC in partnership with our partners Transparentem and IJM UK that we just wrapped up and launched a report for. So this is the first time really speaking about it to an audience. So yeah, this was part of a series of projects that the Modern Slavery PEC funded. The other projects were focused more on business and supply chains, but our part of the research was to look at how we could essentially mainstream or find opportunities for modern slavery and climate change legislation and policymakers to be more aligned and potentially work together in the future, considering both issues at the same time. In order to do this, we had two main research questions. To what extent practices of modern slavery and climate change are currently considered, and how they might be better aligned. So what is the current state of play, and how can we improve potential integration in the future? And we did this through a series of different methods. So we first looked at what the current evidence and literature was saying. So that involved a lot of policy briefings, research articles, reports from NGO organizations. And we were reviewing sort of how modern slavery and climate change were currently being talked about, and what recommendations were already being provided around how modern slavery and climate change can be addressed at the same time. This was followed by a review of legislation and policy, both in the UK, so looking at both all four nations and the current policies that are available both on climate change and modern slavery, and then also internationally. So what are other countries doing that the UK could potentially learn from? Much of that was focused on the European Union and the US, as they have quite similar views around how forced labour or modern slavery might be tackled. And so they were sort of the main places we drew from, but also we looked more globally, looking at things like Australia, some countries in South Asia, including Vietnam, and looking at how learnings from those locations might be useful for the UK. And then we undertook a series of interviews with governance actors. And governance actors in this research included people from the civil service, people who work at public bodies, and parliamentarians, so people working within the sort of policy space. And then that was followed up once we'd come up with some recommendations by a focus group with some of those governance actors to sort of review the feasibility and how well some of those recommendations may be or may not be implemented. So our key findings, I'm just going to briefly run through these because I think the recommendations is the way more interesting part. But we found there were a series of gaps in who was talking to who. So those in the modern slavery space were very open to the idea of climate change being part of their work, but oftentimes they were not able to engage or hadn't previously engaged with their counterparts in the climate change space. So there was this obvious and identifiable gap. And the project itself helped draw some of those people together, which was quite encouraging, seeing how they could potentially collaborate in the future. Inclusion of decent work was already noted in the Scottish and Northern Ireland's climate change legislation. So there's already some really interesting policy advancements being undertaken in the UK that other areas in England and Wales could potentially learn from when considering how we frame modern slavery and climate change through a potential just transition lens. And just transition is essentially moving from away from fossil fuels into more carbon neutral technologies in a way that's fair and it's equitable for all workers and all communities. So it's thinking about how that transition might potentially be an avenue for inclusion of modern slavery. I think there are definitely lessons that we can learn in the long run around legislation. So there was a lot of interest around the European Union's new legislation that combines environment and human rights, which includes modern slavery and climate change. And although it's coming up against some final hurdles, the interest there was something that could be seen as a potential long-term impact. So addressing and changing legislation takes a very long time, but understanding how the implementation is happening in other places, how well it's going, or if there's something that can be improved for the UK context, is something that we identified as a potential avenue for future policy development, and something that's happening now with the private members bill going through Parliament at the minute that Baroness Lily Young is working on, which is around business and human rights and sort of an environment in supply chains. But I think in the medium term, there's an opportunity for instead of new legislation, which obviously takes a long time, to pick up where we improve where things have potentially stopped going through Parliament. So the Modern Slavery Act, Section 54, which is around businesses and supply chains, was considered as something that could be picked up for its improvements, which had already been suggested but have been shelved at the moment. And there's a potential there for combining extra, what we call environmental, social and governance frameworks. So having a bit more of the environment included in the Modern Slavery Act might be a way of getting some of this combined action rather than doing something completely brand new that takes a lot of time. And I think something that we definitely found when looking at that evidence review, and something that we have pulled on for our recommendations, is what the 4 main themes of recommendations that are currently being provided are. So we identified those and structured our recommendations for policy actors in this framework. And much of the categories are separate, but there are these cross-cutting themes focusing on lived experience inclusion, the need for further research, which is something policymakers called for. They need the evidence to be able to make the policies, and then the focus on that just transition, cutting across all of the themes. In terms of governance, we have, I think there's 17 full recommendations in the report. I'm just going to focus on like a few of the interesting ones that I thought might be good to go through in this seminar, but all of the main ones are available in the research summary and then in a bit more detail in the full report. But essentially, in terms of governance, we recognise that there needs to be more cross-departmental collaboration, and the mechanisms, like how is that essentially undertaken and achieved. So we recognise that this needs to be done at multiple scales, so both within each individual government and the departments within those, but also from the UK national to devolved administration levels. There's a big gap in some of the conversations that are happening between Westminster and other locations across the UK, which can definitely be filled just through a bit of internal networking, but having the means and who is facilitating that networking is something quite important. And then I think that also goes to the international scale as well. So I think there's real opportunities for the UK to take a lead in how we address modern slavery and its intersectional risks with climate change. So how is climate change impacting modern slavery in terms of the role that they play in the new Global Commission on Modern Slavery and the role of the FCDO's Modern Slavery Envoy when working with partners. As I noted earlier, legislative change is quite ambitious and it can be challenging, but I think there are those efforts that are already underway to improve the current situation in the policy through the Business, Human and Environment Act that had previously been proposed and the one that's sort of going through the private members bill at the moment, offer those opportunities to really consider the environment and modern slavery in combination. And that's something that we can really achieve. And as I mentioned, I think improving current legislation through amendments is a potential avenue in the short term, whilst we aim for something that's a bit more expansive in its scope and captures more of those driving risks and vulnerabilities. In terms of knowledge to action, which was the second of the four sort of recommendation themes, a lot of the work around this focused much more on the evidence building and the sharing of that evidence. So how is it shared? Who is it being shared to? And a part of that comes from gathering the evidence in the first place. So research funding was something that was identified as a potential mechanism for helping fill some of those data gaps and really be able to underpin and support evidence-based policy making and be embedded in the decisions that are being made within Parliament. And then in terms of capacity building, if I can move the slide, in terms of capacity building, didn't move the slides, capacity building, we were looking a lot at climate change adaptation finance. So this is something that the government already contributes to, but we recognise that the investment that is made is already quite is already not adequate for what the impacts of climate change that are happening in the UK. So we said that increased investment should be made available, and that investment should be made. There should be extra support available essentially for communities that are impacted by climate change, but then also that makes them potentially more vulnerable to forms of exploitation. And we also note that that should be something that's facilitated across the international setting. So through the loss and damage funds, which are essentially an international finance mechanism that has been established at the environmental COP conferences to support low middle income countries predominantly who are impacted by climate change, recognising those communities that are being affected by climate change and then have an additional level of potential risk is something that we think the UK could potentially be a leader on, making those with multiple forms of risk, such as climate change and modern slavery, more supported by such funds. And then something that I think would be good in the UK context is more community-based investment, and that can come from both government and private businesses. Basically providing support to organisations who are leading on interventions around modern slavery and interventions on climate change, and also facilitating that network between groups, particularly if they're operating in the same geographic locations, to be able to support communities on the ground through active community-led practices. And then finally, our recommendations covered support for lived experience inclusion. Some of these were tailored specifically to the IASC office, but I think the main key takeaway that we took from this was how lived experience inclusion should be included at all elements and stages of policy making and the evidence process, and it should be both tailored and empowering, ensuring that the process of engagement is not extractive, which I think at the Modern Slavery PEC is something that probably gets mentioned in every report, but I think it's important to reiterate that it's something that we did note again here. And then just as I wrap up, I think the next steps are mainly around, and these are my personal interested next steps, but I think there's a range of things that we can undertake. But I think looking at the implementation of and success or failures of combined modern slavery and climate change action in other locations is something that we should be actively undertaking to be able to provide guidance to policymakers in potentially pushing forward things like the current private members bill. And I think there needs to be a larger focus, and this series of projects was quite good because some of them were focusing specifically on the UK, but looking directly at those connections between modern slavery and climate change in the UK context. It's something that people across government have called for, and that understanding of how climate change is impacting on workers, but oftentimes it's undertaken in other places. As Owen mentioned, lots of my work's been in not the UK. So I think it's really important that we continue that work with partners overseas, but we also start to really look at that from a domestic standpoint. And then looking at how well the recommendations are taken up by departments. You know, we've sent these out to lots of people across different parts of the government in both the national and devolved administrations, and it'll be interesting to see over time how people are potentially integrating, even if it's just through active communication between departments. That's already an improvement on where we were previously. So yeah, that is the summary of our very quick, fast turnaround. But I look forward to any questions that you might have. And yeah, hopefully I can answer them all.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Beth. Sorry about feedback. That was a really, really interesting presentation. Thank you. And it's such a kind of clearly a really important and emerging area where so much kind of remains to be done, which is also quite exciting because I think in some of the recommendations you highlighted obvious ways in which we can move forwards. In some respects, maybe not with a massive amount of additional resource or effort, although some obviously might require that, which I think is always really encouraging to hear. So I can see one or two questions coming through. Please, a reminder to everyone, do drop them in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to come on camera and ask them. But I'm going to be a bit cheeky and ask first question myself because this is something I'm really interested in. One thing I was wondering about, Beth, was obviously you've got, in terms of the climate change policy area, you've got in broad terms climate change mitigation to try and reduce the risks, and you've also got adaptation to kind of what those impacts might bring about. Should modern slavery be integrated across both of those different sort of types of policy making? And are there any differences in how that integration should happen, do you think? Or is it pretty much the same in each case, that we just need that focus on modern slavery to be integrated?
I think in terms of mitigation, it's a little bit more obvious. A lot of the work around interventions around modern slavery try to happen at the point before exploitation happens, and I think that is a natural integration point for climate change mitigation to be combined in that. A lot of not this project, but a lot of the stuff that we do in Bangladesh around climate change and human trafficking was focused on the intervention point of prior to migration and potential exploitation. And a lot of that was around how can you be more climate resilient, which is an adaptation technique. So I think adaptation and mitigation go hand in hand. It's what responses are being undertaken to support those communities. And you know, migration is an adaptive capacity in some locations. And it's really about having the right people in the right places. So I think before is a sort of mitigation measure, but also recognizing that people respond differently to climate change, and I don't think there's any right or wrong way to mitigate or adapt, particularly if you're doing it at an individual level. But yeah, I would say it has to be integrated at both levels. I think the place it will come most is in the mitigation and trying to prevent prior to any form of exploitation, like you would prior to climate change. But a lot of it will be responsive in the adaptation part, unfortunately.
Sure. That makes complete sense. Thank you. Okay, we've got a hand up from Tom Davis. So Tom, I think you should be able to turn on your camera and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask that question.
Great. Yeah, I think, am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you now. I can bring you on screen as well if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Oh, I've done my hair. Excellent. So yes, fantastic talk, Beth. Really interesting. I was wondering, in terms of like the future research and you know, finding evidence, what kind in your research so far, what kind of examples have you found of climate change kind of interrelating with modern day slavery? What kind of like examples of that are there? And I guess a kind of second point, and this is kind of off the top of my head and a half-baked thought, if you like. I wonder if there's a separate ongoing project here that looks at the role of modern day slavery in some of the techno solutions to climate change. So I'm thinking about the cobalt industry in the Congo, lithium mining in South Africa, rare earth minerals used in wind farms, and if not modern day slavery, then extreme exploitation. Whether that perhaps does the greenwashing of technological fixes, does that kind of kind of greenwash the potential modern day slavery? Like on the one hand, yes, there's exploitation, but hey, look at the wind farms and we're in a climate emergency. So there might be an interesting tension there as well. So yeah, half-baked thoughts and ideas, but thanks for the talk.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think answer the first question. Generally, climate change is often seen as a risk, like a stress multiplier, or it exacerbates pre-existing social or economic risks. So often leading to risks around displacement and essentially pushing people into potential forms of exploitation. So that's essentially the main connection between the two. In the UK context, there's really not much, which is why I'm trying to always get funding for the UK context. Yeah, much of it is focused on South Asia, African nations. There's a little bit on South America, but it's much more. Laurie Parsons has a nice term. It's like the outsourcing of climate change. So I think that, and I think that goes to your second point as well, like we outsource the risk when we try to mitigate against climate change as well. So it's not a half-baked idea because I've written about it before. In terms of the links between how we are responding to climate change, I think a lot of we did a study, like one of the classic pandemic studies, where we were looking at the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 8 and ending modern slavery, and against the environment SDGs, and where there would be benefits to the environment by ending slavery and vice versa, and where there would be negatives. And the only one that had a potential increase or negative impact on modern slavery was SDG 7, which is all about renewable energy. So there is this dilemma. I think a lot of people, and I know Anti-Slavery International wrote about this in one of the other projects that was part of this series that Modern Slavery PEC did, was focused on Uyghur forced labor in the solar panel supply chain. So I think there's definitely people are talking about the exploitation, but I don't know if anyone's really come at it through the angle of greenwashing, which I should have put in a paper I just submitted. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that people are talking about, but I don't think we've really reached the point of, so how do we stop that from happening? Because we know that we still need to transition. So that probably needs more thinking, but I think it also needs the climate change folks on board.
Can I make one follow-up point? That's really interesting, Beth. I was just thinking in terms of, and that's so interesting, that tension that you draw out there. But, you know, if that was a research finding of a project, one would have to be really careful about how it's used, because, hey, wouldn't the fossil fuel industry love to find out that, you know, modern day slavery linked to climate adaptation, boom, headlines, etc. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Yeah, thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much for the question, Tom. And I've just dropped a link into the chat to that project you mentioned, Beth, on Uyghur forced labour in green technology supply chains. And I think in some of their findings and their recommendations, they deal directly with that last point around, well, what do you do if there are these risks in important in supply chains of these important technologies? I'm going to pick a question out of the chat here without naming the person, and that's only so that we retain kind of the anonymity of these for the purposes of the recording. I'll just read it out. So the question is, especially when looking at governance and talking to international policymakers, do you think there's potential for improving the situation in the modern slavery climate change nexus through addressing security issues, such as state actor corruption or rule of law on a global governance level, which I guess kind of broadens out the question beyond the two specific issues of modern slavery and climate change, and starts to bring in some some broader governance issues. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that, Beth.
I'm gonna upfront not gonna claim I'm a security expert. So I think definitely talking about it from an international perspective is really important. We hadn't considered necessarily the security aspect, just because that's not our expertise, but we had thought about it from like a supply chain and trade aspect. So I think the same principles could potentially apply. Obviously, things like the Five Eyes Committee, most of the members of that now have some kind of modern slavery legislation. They're all supposed to be like leading on climate change, but often where we'd considered it was more around essentially like, you know, if you were interested in climate change and modern slavery, how do you, is there the potential to integrate that in your bilateral trade agreements, for example, as like a part of the signatory, I don't know what it's called, but when a trade agreement is signed, is there something in there around like you should be working on implementing something similar to the Modern Slavery Act or improving on the Modern Slavery Act, something like that. So we focused on it a bit more from that business perspective side, but I think the security element would just be, would also sort of reflect that if you were considering, you know, when you're undertaking your diplomacy and people are networking at these events, having some sort of bilateral or intergovernmental alliance on that of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So you mentioned trade and supply chains and the role of business. Another question in the chat asks specifically about the cocoa chocolate sector, or I think is kind of giving that as an example, I guess, of a supply chain where we know there are both impacts in terms of labor exploitation, but also environmental impacts. And the person asking this question mentions the new EU regulation on deforestation. But I guess there is a broader question there as well about sort of the kind of how you integrate efforts to address labor exploitation and climate change impact down long and complex supply chains, where we definitely know from the modern slavery sector there are obviously challenges in how you do that and lots of work being done on how to do it better. So I don't know if you want to reflect at all on how the supply chain element links across the two and whether there are any lessons we can learn from either the modern slavery area for climate change or vice versa.
Yeah, so I think the Deforestation Act was one that we had included, I think, as sort of like a good example of sort of efforts that are being made that can potentially be, I don't know, expanded, or they can be learned from in terms of how you combine. I think across supply chains, I think engaging with businesses is really important. Obviously, we were focused in this project specifically on on governance actors in the UK, so we didn't look directly at supply chains. But I think I think it's so important that we consider the unintended consequences almost. I think fair trade is a good example of this. So it was like, oh no, everything's going wrong, so people pull out of a market, and that can lead to additional risks, which is why I think the community-led aspect is so important, and that's where a lot of the funding and efforts should be placed. Potentially drawing together, in the same way we like aim to do that in the governance space, right, is drawing together people working on labour and people working on climate. It's about getting them in the same room, because there are definitely overlapping goals. I think being able to do that at a community level that's really localized, because climate change impacts do vary so greatly. I think that's the place that the interventions should be working on, and that can, that's like learning from each other as well. I think that's a really important part of any collaboration, is like there will be things that the climate change folks know that the modern slavery folks don't, and vice versa. And I think there's a lot that climate folks can learn from the anti-slavery sector, because the environment does have a history of previously just going, oh, we can do human rights, and they don't know anything about it, right? So it's avoiding that as well, and the sort of monopolization of an issue that people don't have expertise on. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think completely makes sense, and it also links back to an earlier point you made when you were just talking about how you've done this research. And one of the things you really emphasized was the importance of bringing people together in a room who are from different departments or different governments, different policy areas who maybe don't normally talk to one another. And you talked a little bit about how the process of doing the research had actually helped to achieve that by carrying out these focus groups. So I think that's a really interesting example of kind of policy impacts, not just through a recommendation for a change to a policy, but actually through engaging policymakers in different ways. So just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how that worked, how you found it, and whether there are any kind of learnings for future projects as well.
Yeah, I think from the outside, like often, especially if you're like early career, you're new to sort of like research and engaging with governance actors, or you've never done it before and you're like interested in it. I learned a lot about this project, about how government works, which was really interesting. And useful to know, because I think people just assume that everyone knows each other across departments, and that's not the case at all. It seems to be very much run like each department is its own like businessy type entity, and there's not that much collaboration across. Like people don't know who their equivalent is in a different department. It's something, there's systems in place, but people don't really use them, or they don't work very well. I think that's really important to, and makes a lot of sense why there are such gaps. Yeah, I think there was a lot of willingness. So we definitely had a couple of climate change folks and a couple of modern slavery folks in the same focus group in one of our focus groups or group interviews that we ran. And yeah, we were like, do you know anyone in this place? And they were like, I've heard of this person, I've never met them before. Let me email them and loop them in. And it was like, okay, great. So it's happening in some locations, but like I guess it was like sort of like the prompt to just make them do it. They'd not done it before, but this sort of gave them the nudge to engage with one another. And there were clearly instances where things were happening in a similar way across their departments, but they weren't really talking about it. And I think it just opened doors, which was really great to see. Whether it comes of anything in terms of like policy or how they work, I'm not sure, right? But like, I think just even in the encouragement of, oh, hang on a minute, I can talk to that person, and oh wait, they do this thing over there that might be tangentially linked, like it might be useful to chat to them, I think was quite positive and encouraging in that sense. And yeah, we didn't really speak to many like high profile people. It was all sort of civil service workers that are doing like the hard grind. And I think there's a lot of passion there, and there's a lot of willingness to share and learn. And I think sometimes it's just finding the right person to talk to, and that can often be daunting from the outside, and also hard as well, right? Because there's a lot of turnover and people moving departments and changing roles and things. But yeah, it was really interesting insight, and I think it was, I mean, I hope that they found it useful being involved, and I definitely took a lot from them as learning points for the project as well.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly useful sort of point to emphasize, that the complexity, the turnover, the challenge in finding the right person, and recognizing that people just might not always be as connected as you think they might be. But I think that really demonstrates perhaps an unexpected value of the research process that we don't normally think about. It's not just producing an evidence base, it's helping to co-produce a community of people who will coalesce around that, which I think is a really interesting outcome of the work that you've done. Okay, so we are close to coming up on time, so I think we could start to kind of wrap up there, unless anyone had any last questions, in which case feel free to drop them in the chat. But thank you everyone for coming along. It's really great to have seen such a good turnout, and I know from seeing the people who registered, it was a really diverse mix today, which was excellent to see. Thank you so much, Beth, for coming along and presenting. It was hugely useful to hear about your work and its findings and recommendations. Finally, if when you registered you told us that you're happy for us to be in touch with you in future, we'll be adding you to our newsletter where we share regular updates. But if you didn't, you can still sign up for that separately through our website. And again, link to that is now in the chat. And we also run a Google group mailing list where anyone can post information about any work they're doing, or ask for inputs. And again, the link to sign up for that is in the chat now. And it's a good international diverse mix of about sort of 300-ish people, I think, at this point. So please do join if you'd find that useful. I think that's everything. We will follow up by email within the next week or so with a link to the recording when that's ready, and also information about our next lunchtime seminar in March. Topic to be announced shortly, but I think it's going to be a really interesting one. So thanks again, Beth. Thanks everyone so much for coming, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks.